My lords, as I alluded to in my report covering the intergalactic menace known as the Blokkat Harvesters, there is a race of incredibly potent psionic lagomorphs occupying a planet called Paluush. This race, known as the Palush, have fought and defeated the Blokkats before, and are, at least in part, responsible for their creation and subsequent galactic harvest. I shall detail what we know about the Palush in this report, including their wars with the Blokkats. The Palush are a sapient species of large and psionically capable rabbit-like creatures, originating from the temperate world of Paluush, Katsanland's second and largest moon in the Gatso system. They are notorious for their idyllic lifestyle under the watchful eye of the Grand Bunny, as well as their incredibly powerful psionic capabilities which grant them near complete mastery over the elements. The Palush are generally isolationist, tending to avoid contact with outsiders wherever possible and opting to preserve the idyllic agrarian lifestyle at the cost of foregoing technological prowess. This lifestyle was drastically disturbed during the First and Second Palush-Chablokk War, the Chablokk being the prior name of the Blokkats. These wars saw the Palush emerge in a technological arms race against the invaders, leading to drastic societal and philosophical changes within their civilization, as the Chablokks are eventually defeated, and the Palush would later return to their previous habits. Their calm and peaceful lifestyle is attributed to their innate ability to psionically feel what others are feeling, making them significantly more empathetic than most species and greatly facilitating a mutual understanding between groups. Early history. Following millions of years of evolution on the relatively untouched world of Paluush, the ancestors of the very first Palushes can be said to have gained true sapience around 2 million years ago. Owing to the planet's low gravity, approximately 0.4 g, these beings, much like the rest of Paluush's ecosystem, were gargantuan in size, easily reaching several meters in height. Their large size meant they possessed particularly large brains, although they were not particularly intelligent at this point. Nevertheless, they developed extremely complex neural networks, significantly bolstering the likelihood that psionic powers would later manifest themselves. These powers, however, remained mostly passive for a large part of their early history, that is until they awakened. After several hundred millennia of extremely slow population growth, a psionic awakening occurred within a large part of the Palush population. This event was later dubbed the Awakening. From that moment onwards, the Palush capabilities grew quickly in power and strength as they learned to hone and specialize their psionic skills. What powers an individual would manifest was essentially random, however most fell into the category of elemental manipulation, i.e. the ability to control earth, fire, water and air, but also even electrical and magnetic signals, as well as metals, and even an ability to heal instantly. The emergence of these powers meant that pre-existing societal structures quickly began to fall apart, and were replaced with hierarchies based entirely on the usefulness and potential of one's psionic capabilities. This led to an increasingly high competitiveness between Palush individuals, as everyone attempted to leverage their abilities to acquire more power for themselves. It wasn't long before the situation eventually exploded into a state of mostly permanent conflict between tribes across Paluush. This era was known as the Era of Strife. Post-psionic awakening, their history was characterized by near constant violence and bloodshed, where Palushes would relentlessly slaughter one another with great violence owing to their psionic prowess. It is during this time that the dominant masteries emerged, namely fire, water, air, earth, light, metal, thunder, healing, and finally gravity, as they were the ones granting the greatest advantage to their bearers. There were other, less useful abilities, but these appear to have been progressively eradicated through natural selection, as they simply could not compete with the usefulness of the aforementioned masteries. Within several millennia, these were completely eradicated from the Palush gene pool. Peace, it seemed, would never last, as the most powerful psionics constantly attempted to leverage their innate abilities for their own personal benefit, and thus a myriad of competing Palush kings would regularly attempt to conquer vast swathes of Paluush before their empire would eventually collapse into infighting between the petty warlords. The planet's population rose and fell, quite regularly fluctuating between just over 100 million to several billion. Every Paluush nation would push out millions upon millions of offspring each year during mating season to compensate for the constant war-related casualties. The lifespan of these people were far too irregular. Some would die mere years after their birth due to war or accident, while those who managed to survive could live for hundreds or sometimes thousands of years, often leading to them becoming extremely stubborn. As these elders often ended up in leadership positions, this further instilled the Paluush societal development and perpetuated the ongoing state of war. Furthermore, their high reliance on masteries meant that their technology never really progressed beyond medieval tools and methods enhanced by the masteries. It was indeed nearly impossible for proper technology to develop during the Age of Strife, as actually overtaking the capabilities of a mastery with an artificial device required advancing to at least something like space-era technology. This would have been so time-consuming that anyone attempting to get this far would undoubtedly end up being conquered before achieving a sufficient level of development. All advancements were thus focused entirely on improving in the ways that masteries were utilized. Particularly ambitious leaders sometimes undertook early forays into atmospheric and space travel. During the most successful of these endeavors, gravity masters would actually throw satellites into orbit, but these were generally little more than polished mirrors used by light masters to bounce signals around. There are rumors that midway through this period, a single empire did almost succeed in uniting the planet under a single banner, and even managed to fire a number of individual spacecraft to other planets in their system. These planets were named Katzenland and Inet. If rumours are to be believed, they were left on these worlds, unable to return home, and their fate is unknown. This state of strife lasted another few thousand years, until there was a planet-wide cull leaving only a few million Paluush alive. This coincided with the birth of the being that we know as the Grand Bunny. The being who still, after all these thousands of years, leads the Paluush people. The birth of the Grand Bunny. Following this planet-wide cull, the remaining Paluush people began to unite. It appears that their psionic link began to subconsciously connect with one another, forming a sort of psionic network structure within the Shroud. This structure grew over several centuries, like a sort of giant neural network, manifested from all the psionic essences of all the Paluush. Animated by a genuine desire to bring peace to Paluushia, this newly sapient entity eventually incarnated into a sort of legendary Paluush, born out of nowhere, but preaching the words of peace and unity. It appears that the Paluush people immediately and subconsciously agreed and followed it. This entity would grow in influence across Paluushia, becoming more and more powerful as its physical form took hold. After a century or so of expanding its influence, the entity was fully realized, having united all of Paluushia under a single government and achieving a truly deity-like status amongst the people. After a glorious ceremony that saw the entity officially proclaimed protector and matriarch of Paluushia, it became known as the Grand Bunny, and would then work tirelessly to utilize its gargantuan psionic potential to mend the wounds that the era of strife had inflicted upon Paluushia. Devastated landscapes were restored to their pristine glory, natural resources were replenished, ecosystems would flourish once more, and feelings of hatred and anger were ultimately evicted from the collective Paluush psyche. It appears that the Paluush people had manifested themselves a god of sorts. The Reshaping. The Paluush people found themselves connected by an intense psionic connection, enabling them to truly understand one another and helping them live in complete harmony. It appears that their masteries were also amplified by the psionic connection. The progressive spread of the practice of raising the younglings as a community instead of separating into families meant that the entire species had become akin to a single giant family, and thus bonds between the Paluush people became ever stronger. The Paluush people, now united as one, undertook a great effort known as the Reshaping. This aimed to make their homeworld's climate and surface as pleasant as possible. Hostile fauna and flora were modified to be peaceful and agreeable by the manipulation of their souls. Crops and food were enhanced to be extremely nutritious and useful, notably leading to the creation of the carrot, an oversized, elongated orange vegetable which form the basis of Paluush nourishment, while special types of trees were created which yielded stupendously resilient and tensile wood. Contact was even established with Eternium. As Eternite explorers set foot on Paluush, they had originally intended to conquer the planet in Eternium's name. However, they decided that the danger posed by a theoretically angered Grand Bunny meant that Alice I eventually decided that it was not worth her time, and thus the Eternites simply partook the trading of quaint cultural artifacts with the Paluush people, many of which are still showcased today on both Paluush and Aeondia. Roughly 10,000 years since the Grand Bunny's awakening, the reshaping was deemed to be complete, and the Paluush people began to remodel their own society, organising themselves into countless small nations known as Maya lands. These Maya lands were then left to organise themselves however they wished, and no immediate authority emerged between the Maya lands and the Grand Bunny herself. All was done, and Paluush had been refined to perfection, its climate forever pleasant, and its surface providing the countless Paluush Maya lands with everything that they needed. The Paluush people would be born and live in a pleasant lifestyle within their communities, meeting many other like-minded Paluush. They would create art and partake in great festivals with their kind. Of course, none of this produced anything of lasting value beyond the enrichment of their ever-growing cultural heritage. It would appear that nothing of real significance would happen for the next several million years. The Paluush people would live long, peaceful lives in relative happiness under the Grand Bunny's wing. The Grand Bunny's power, however, was not limitless, and she regularly had to undertake a grand slumber in order to properly replenish her psionic potential. 12 such slumbers would happen over the next million years, roughly 100,000 years apart, with each lasting just over a millennium. These slumbers often saw slight technological prowess to compensate for the lack of the Grand Bunny's power, but the first 11 of them went without any real trouble. It is around these slumbers that the Paluush calendar came to be based, with dates restarting once the Grand Bunny fell into slumber or awakened once more. The 12th slumber, the arrival of the Chablokks. Roughly 2 centuries into the 12th Grand Slumber, a large, several kilometre long silvery vessel crash-landed onto Paluush's northern hemisphere. The impact was cataclysmic, wiping out several Maya lands and killing thousands of Paluush in mere instants, while a raging fire consumed vegetation and wildlife for weeks afterwards. Out of the remains of the vessel emerged a small race of yellow-bodied creatures with strangely geometric bodies. These creatures systematically murdered all Paluushers attempting to investigate the impact site. This news spread across the planet like wildfire. Despite this, the Paluush people erred on the side of caution, and before taking any drastic action, they attempted to coexist alongside these creatures by intentionally seeding a perimeter surrounding the vessel. The Chablokks, however, who were not psionic, instead opted to constantly mislead the Paluush for their own gain. After a series of theft, land incursions, and repeated violent skirmishes, Paluush people grew to an utter planet-wide outrage. A meeting was called, and it was decreed that this would be the start of an immediate purification crusade aiming to eliminate the threat of the Chablokk invaders. However, despite the Paluush unification, the Chablokks were armed with fusion-era weaponry, while their best weaponry consisted of crude spears made from repurposed kitchen utensils. While their masteries could theoretically be used for war, the mere act of harming another being with one's mastery was unheard of at this time, and thus the Paluush had to rely on hastily assembled wooden and stone weaponry during their attempts to hold the Chablokks back. It is only thanks to their large size that they were able to avoid complete extermination. Several years went by, and the Chablokks had somewhat slowed down, but the Paluush people were nevertheless subjected to a relentless pressure. The Chablokks continued to creep forwards with every passing year, and the Paluush people came to realise that simply attempting to weather and dampen the assault would only work for so long. It was only a matter of time before the Chablokks' superior might and organisation would overcome whatever defences they could muster. And thus, with a heavy heart, they decided that a grand reorganisation had to be undertaken in an attempt to even the odds, even if it meant abandoning their lifestyle which had prevailed for several million years. Counter-offensive. From this point on, Paluush technology advanced rapidly. notably thanks to the efforts of the Grandmaster Paidi, a tremendously old elder and the only living Paluush to have witnessed the era of Strife firsthand. The Grandmaster, alongside the brightest Palushian minds, pushed for a particular focus on developing technologies that would amplify and synergize with their masteries. Meanwhile, a proper Paluush army began to take shape, transitioning from grassroots militia to a properly organized and armed force. Shortly after this, two cunning Paluush leaders known as Warlord Beacon and Commander Raghul spearheaded an operation called Bunfall. This was the first Paluush offensive into Chablokk-held territory. Bolstered by their clairvoyance and some early experimental mastery-based weaponry, the offensive turned out to be a resounding success. They ambushed the supply lines and captured numerous Chablokk engineers in the process, while retaking hundreds of kilometers of land. The Paluush people attempted to undertake psionic integration of the Chablokk engineers in order to better understand their weaponry and technology. Through this, they were able to begin production of individually crafted armors, as well as mastery-enhanced weaponry based on tank cannons that the Chablokks carried as infantry rifles. Another revolutionary invention was the Thunderlance, a long metallic rod capable of enhancing and focusing a Thundermaster's powers into a powerful and precise bolt of lightning, capable of striking distant targets with relative ease. The Paluush people nevertheless remained mostly on the defensive, and continued to be driven back by the Chablokks. But the Paluush military, confident in their newfound weaponry and clairvoyance, launched a second blistering counter-offensive. Able to predict the vague results of each battle, the Paluush harried the Chablokk supply lines, defeating them in protracted sieges. The Chablokks lost several important mining operations, and all efforts to retake facilities were routed. Following years of successful Paluush campaigns recapturing large swathes of occupied territory, the Chablokks eventually consolidated their forces and managed to fortify their holdings sufficiently. Eventually both sides became unable to push into each other's territory, leading to a stalemate and the establishment of an extremely uneasy ceasefire. This period became known as the Unthinkable Stalemate, as both Paluush and Chablokks scrambled to find a way to break it. Some of the Paluush eventually started arguing that perhaps they should simply focus on holding their ground until the Ground Bunny awakened once more. But their leadership eventually concluded that it was necessary for the Paluush to continue to exert pressure upon the Chablokks and constantly try to outsmart them, lest they be allowed to grow too powerful and potentially slay the Ground Bunny in her sleep. After a long period of philosophical debates regarding whether or not the Paluush should fully commit to utilizing their masteries for war, it led to the conclusion that the Paluush people had to leverage everything they had if they were to win. The Space Age. 50 years of stalemate had passed before the Chablokks began to turn back towards the stars from which they came. They did not attempt to withdraw from the planet completely, fearing that any attempt at full-scale withdrawal would result in their complete extermination. The first Chablokk satellite was launched into orbit, and many more followed. The Paluush, originally dumbfounded by this experiment, quickly adapted and began developing their own countermeasures. The need for these countermeasures was only made more intense by the Chablokks attempting to deploy orbital weaponry. However, following proper forays in the field of orbital mechanics, groups of metal masters were quickly trained to accelerate metallic rods to tremendous speeds, sufficient to breach the atmosphere and destroy these orbital installations. Several years later, the very first functioning Paluush spacecraft took off and reached orbit. It consisted of a sort of metal shell surrounded by a layer of rock, and was propelled by Earth Masters, Metal Masters, and Fire Masters working in tandem. Its primary purpose was to scout Chablokk territories and report back, and thus both sides began exploring the Gatso system, but they remained almost entirely focused on Paluushia itself. All knowledge and resources brought back by space travel were utilised to try and gain an edge in the war, as now over 2 centuries of war had passed. Ultimately, the Paluush seemed to be an advantage, as it was them who slowly yet steadily pushed the Chablokks back. The Chablokks were clever and numerous, but the Paluush people had greater physical strength, incredible psionic capabilities, and an overall unity that afforded them much greater flexibility in the long run. As space travel progressed, landings were progressively undertaken on nearly every single world in the Gatso system over the next few centuries. The Paluush people performed landings on several planets, namely Katsanland, home to the Katsan people, formally establishing relations with their native civilizations. While there were initially some attempts at swaying these civilizations towards the Paluush side, they were all deemed far too primitive to be of any help in the conflict. Several more centuries passed before the Paluush people finally got their act together, and under the command of Warlord Beacon, they launched an all-out assault against the Chablokk territory still occupying parts of their homeworld. Many millions of masters joined the fight, and they ultimately shattered the Chablokk defences and slaughtered billions. Some Chablokks managed to escape into orbit and fled into the depths of interstellar space. The Paluush people had won. Several crusades were undertaken to hunt down the remaining Chablokks who had escaped the Purge. Unfortunately for the galaxy, they were not found, and eventually the Chablokks would morph into the genocidal crisis we know now as the Blokkats. Thanks for watching, folks, and a big thank you to Elowiny, the creator of the Gigastructural Engineering mod and the writer of the Paluush lore. If you want to hear about the Blokkats, please click the video on screen now.